Hello guys! So over the years I have repaired a lot of broken equipment that others had thrown away or that they sold for a good price on online marketplaces because they probably saw little value in it. And for a while I really tried to just fix as much as possible, presenting my work to the world in the attempt to inspire and maybe even educate along the way. Over the past 2 years I have come to the realization though that it's often not enough to simply restore the equipment to functionality. It often has to be upgraded and modified to be suited for daily use in my workshop. Don't get me wrong, many of the machines I worked on are of great quality, but in some cases they simply lack basic safety features that would make them much better suited to be actually used in the workshop daily. One of these machines is this AEG drill press that I restored in a video a few years ago. Today we will take some major steps in making it safer and more practical to use. A machine that has also made a huge difference around here is the CNC plasma table that I built from mostly scrap and used components earlier this year. And while it works fine for the most part and has been used to realize many other projects already, it as well requires major upgrades to work both efficiently and safely on a daily basis. Believe it or not, but this 30-year-old clothes dryer will help us do that. I also found some building materials on the scrap earlier this year that are now finally being used. Unfortunately, I also had to look for materials that will help me to increase another safety or rather security aspect of the workshop, because unfortunately times are not getting any easier around here, I'm afraid. Repeated break-ins at the workshop have cost me a tremendous amount of my time and unpaid work to prepare for the near future. This has caused significant delays in my actual work. And for obvious reasons, I can't share all the details of the security upgrades online, but I can show some of it and will address this later in this video. But there's no time to waste, let's get to work. So a couple of years ago I got my hands on this drill press here. It's an AEG brand type TB12. And I would guess that it was manufactured around World War II. And at the time I was simply drawn in by its beautiful design. I covered the basic restoration in a video a few years ago, and a link to that episode can be found in the video description. After that episode had aired, this machine was put in storage and waited to be called back to action. And then a few months ago, when I had started to restructure my entire workshop, I decided to give it a try and actually use the machine in the shop. But it was clear that it would require a proper stand so that it would sit firmly in place, and also a real belt housing, because this open belt construction style is an accident waiting to happen. The CNC plasma table that I built a few months ago allows me to fabricate much more beautiful parts than what would have been possible at the time of the restoration. So I removed the old belt guard and also pulled off the front pulley in order to take some measurements to come up with a sketch for the parts required to build an enclosure for belt and pulleys. I then took the time to create a proper CAD drawing from the sketch and generated a toolpath for the CNC plasma cutter. I prepared a steel sheet from the scrap by degreasing the surface and then proceeded by cutting out the bottom part of the new enclosure. Followed by the piece that will act as the top side of this new belt guard. I then used a thinner piece of scrap metal to create these long rectangular sections that will act as the side walls of this enclosure. But before being able to actually do the welding, a little more preparation was necessary. After plasma cutting, you will always have a certain amount of dross on the edges. The dross might look nasty, but it's usually only very loosely attached to the edges of the workpiece, and it can be broken off or ground off. And after doing just that, this is what the parts look like. I decided to open up the hole in the back of the bottom sheet. This way I don't have to remove the pulley from the motor. It is stuck and won't budge, and this is a workaround for that, as you will see in just a minute. This piece of steel is a leftover from a broken screw clamp that I will use to attach the bottom sheet to the mount of the old belt guard. The milling machine can be used for all kinds of things, as you will see throughout this video, but it was very expensive. It actually cost me more money than my car, and that's why I don't want to use it as a drill press on a daily basis. These steel parts are a little too long though, and that is where the milling machine can be used as well, of course. Since I worked for so many years without having one in the shop, I still often use angle grinders and other simple tools out of habit. With these two pieces and the bottom of the enclosure in place, I can now use the TIG welder to tag these parts together. I do this early in the process so I can make sure that the guard will actually fit on the machine before things get increasingly complex. A few minutes later, the sheet is then permanently welded to these steel pieces, and we wait for everything to cool down while it's held in place by those two bolts. I have now started to carefully tack one of the rectangular sections of thin steel sheet to the front of the bottom part of the new enclosure. I bend the sheet along the curvature of this stronger part bit by bit. I do a lot of welding on much thicker pieces of steel, but I rarely work with thin sheets like this, and it always takes some getting used to if you switch between different materials of different thickness. After doing this with the bottom piece, I've now also added the top part of the housing. It's a good idea to do this before welding the bottom part in place too permanently, because if you would have misaligned those parts in that first step, it would become very hard to correct that later on. And I proceed to add tack welds until this front piece is attached to both bottom and top. After that, additional rectangular sections are added behind this front part, only leaving the backside open, where this enclosure will be closed with a little door later in this video. After these hind sections have been tacked into place as well, I clean up the welds a little bit. And now I have started to weld the parts together permanently. I first did this only in sections because I wanted to see how the material reacted to the heat. I also wasn't sure at first if I would actually go through the hassle of welding seams all along the enclosure. But in the end I decided to do just that. See, if I complain here that I haven't welded thin steel sheets in a while, it's about time to get some practice. So eventually I closed all the gaps and welded everything, and then let the part sit and cool down for a while. After that I wire brushed the entire part and was actually okay with the seams being visible. Later in the process I still decided to grind them down so that the housing would look more like out of one piece and stick out less from the cast iron frame of this antique drill press. In the meantime, I had made another CAD drawing, and 3 additional parts had been cut out with a plasma cutter. A number of M5 threads were then hand tapped into the enclosure. And this is how I will fasten the covers that can be removed in order to install or change the belt when required. In the next steps, a few more details needed to be taken care of. In order to insert a set screw into the front pulley, this hole needed to be drilled. I also made sure that the pulleys can spin freely inside the housing. This is also the point in time when I had decided to grind the welds down after all, creating a more uniform look. So as you can see, we have made sure that the enclosure fits the machine, that the covers can be installed, and that pulleys and belt can move freely. Only now was it time to paint the parts in the same shade of gray that the drill press was painted in a few years ago. And while we wait for that paint job to dry, there are a few other things to take care of. First, a recycled piece of beech plywood was ground off. And then in the next step, a cast iron support that I had already painted in the past was then chosen to act as a new stand for this drill press. The wooden board was then oiled and bolted to this iron stand. And I then placed the machine on top and bolted it down to the board as well. And by now the paint had dried, and I could finally install the belt housing on the machine's frame. The front pulley was then also inserted and fastened. Then these openings were used to install a flat belt to the old pulleys. A belt like this was unexpectedly pricey, by the way. The only belt I could find that would actually fit is around 35 euros. They just don't make too many of them anymore. The top covers were then bolted in place, and so was the piece of sheet metal that closes the hole in the back of the housing. It really felt good to see it all come together after all this work. In my opinion, the new housing blends in pretty well with this antique machine. What do you think? Another thing, by the way, that I did shortly after was to add two ball-shaped plastic caps on the ends of the handles of the machine. Now all I need for the future is to find a spring that will actually fit these handles as well. Earlier this year I had repaired an industrial plasma cutter that had been sold under the Messer Griesheim brand in the 1980s here in Germany. Based on that successful repair, I then also decided to build my own CNC plasma table, and you have seen these two devices in action in this episode already. I was amazed to learn that there is a small company in the southwest of Germany that still sells consumables for these devices. But more than that, they also repair the old torches and even make new ones for Messer plasma cutters of all sizes, and that goes up to, I think, 500 amps. After learning about all this and really liking the device, I decided to also buy a larger Messer plasma cutter when I saw it online for only 200 bucks on an online marketplace. That unit would be able to cut up to 25mm thick steel parts, that's a little more than 1 inch, and it seemed like a bargain deal because usually they are way more expensive. The Plasmastar HA95 is a few years younger and is from a time when Lincoln Electric had purchased Messer Griesheim, hence the name Messer Lincoln. Unfortunately though, I learned pretty quickly that the actual torch was damaged internally. And unfortunately, that is the only part of this entire machine that I'm currently unable to repair myself. So I had to send the torch in and got it fixed. And it's actually fantastic that someone still offers to do this for decades old equipment. But unfortunately, this cost me an additional 450 euros. Counting the purchase of additional consumables, I've spent around 750 euros on this machine already. After my experience with the somewhat smaller model, I checked the functionality of everything else, and I also cleaned the coolant tank and renewed the coolant, of course. The bigger unit is now fully operational as well. But there are a few compatibility issues with the CNC table that I built, and we have to take care of that. In order to make it more ergonomic, the torch of the AH95 no longer has a 90-degree angle between nozzle and handle, and this meant that I had to design an adapter piece to connect it to the CNC table. But unfortunately, the new torch also emits way more heat, which has melted the 3D printed adapter. The reason why the new torch makes the plastic melt and the old torch doesn't is because they work on different principles. The torch of the HA60 uses a method called Kontaktschneiden in German, meaning contact cutting, meaning that there is no air gap between the tip of the torch and the workpiece. This is actually great, as it's only cutting away a very narrow line. The HA95's torch, however, requires an air gap, and that is why it has this consumable spacer part here. This is quite typical, and you can see this in all kinds of plasma cutters. One downside to this approach, however, is that the parts close to the nozzle get much hotter, and hence the molten 3D printed part. In other words, we have to remake this part, but this time from metal, using the milling machine. So here is a dumpster filled with aluminium scrap, and that's also where I found this piece here. It's actually a little too large, but it's the only one I have that is big enough to make the part we want. So after scribing the outlines of the part onto one surface, I start by roughing the block down to the maximum outer dimensions that our part has in both X, Y, and Z directions. Since the initial block of aluminium is way bigger than our part, many passes are necessary here. I rely on the digital scales for precision, but it's also super practical to just have the 3D printed positive to simply compare the workpiece to it over and over again. And this is probably not the last time I'll be doing it like that. Design a part on the computer, print it out to see if it fits and works in its intended purpose, and then make a metal replica on the milling machine, if the circumstances make that necessary. After this roughing process is over, the block has the right size in all three dimensions. Using an even bigger mill than before, I'm now turning the block into an L-shaped profile. Since I bought a tremendous amount of tooling together with the milling machine, I still have to work my way through even sorting all the cutters that I own now. I have been able to find the time to sift through most of it, but still haven't found the time to try many of them. And one of these tools are the edge rounding mills that came with the machine, that you can use to cut radii. One of the biggest of these cutters comes into play here. Again, several passes are needed here until we have managed to turn an L-shaped profile into a P-shaped one. For the next step, it is now necessary to cut straight slots into that P, and you could use a small end mill to do that. But a job like this is actually best done with a disc cutter. And here you can see why it's called Universalfräsmaschine in German, meaning universal milling machine. It combines vertical and horizontal mill into one machine. We are now going to use it for horizontal milling. Luckily, I was able to purchase a bunch of these disc cutters along with the machine. I first did a few test cuts into the material here on the side that I will later remove anyway, just to find out if these cutters are sharp enough and what kind of speed seems to work well here. The disc cutter did a fine job here though, and the corresponding plastic part already fits into these slots just fine. After switching back to the vertical milling configuration, we are now able to remove even more material on the sides, and here I have placed the 3D printed part next to it again so you can see what I'm talking about. This has to be repeated on the other side as well, of course. And after having done that, a somewhat smaller mill can now be used to cut out the U-shaped opening that will eventually accommodate the tip of the plasma torch. Since the original design was a little narrow anyway, I decided here to increase the width of this opening significantly by choosing a larger diameter mill. So that's what the two parts look like side by side now. In a final operation, after the mill has been swapped out for a chuck, the milling machine is now used to drill a number of holes into the workpiece. And there you go. The part is already installed, And I guess it's time for a test cut with the new plasma cutter and the new adapter now. So while the new plasma cutter has cut through this 8mm steel plate like butter, another problem has become obvious to me right away. As opposed to the contact cutting process, this style of plasma torch causes way more fumes to rise from the workpiece. And especially now that winter is coming here, where I can't just open all the windows all the time here, this is the next big issue that needs to be handled. So let's do it then. Okay, so one of the major downsides of the plasma cutting process is that it emits metal vapors and fumes that aren't exactly great for your health. Welding creates similar hazards, and that's one more reason why I enjoy working outside so much. Finding a way to suck up the fumes from the plasma CNC table could also create a safer environment for welding. In order to make that possible, I will need a number of things that will cost me a lot of money once again. A proper blower this size, for example, is around 200 euros. This particular model is based on a BLDC with variable speed. For our purpose, that's unnecessarily complex. But what if I told you that I know a way to get my hands on two blowers of similar size for next to nothing? So I went on an online marketplace and bought this broken clothes dryer for 10 euros from a lady who lives around the corner. It's a Miele brand dryer and it's around 30 years old. Here in Germany, Miele is considered by many to be the best there is in terms of white goods, especially when it comes to washing machines. And I can personally attest to having seen working Miele washing machines from when Ronald Reagan was in office. And this workshop's kitchen actually has a running dishwasher that has actually been built when Johnny Cash was in the charts with one piece at a time. That was in 1976. But that's a story for another day, I guess. This dryer could probably be fixed, but there are actually tons and tons of these old Miele dryers available online. In many cases you can just pick them up for free. Many people in Germany, including my parents by the way, have always been opposed to the idea of using dryers in general. And I have only used them a few times in my life as well, mostly when I was traveling in other countries. But be that as it may, a few years ago I was constantly on the lookout for good parts, and I picked up all kinds of equipment from people who had been giving away stuff on the internet. At that time I took just about everything apart that you can get your hands on, and learned that the old Miele dryers have two separate blowers with two independent motors that have very high potential to be reused in other applications. The bigger of the two blowers looks like this and was used in a very similar way in their dryers for many years. The second blower comes in its own discrete enclosure in older models, but was then fused with a bunch of other plastic later on, like in this model, which makes it a little harder to reuse, but there is a way and I'll show you how in just a few minutes. So here is again salvage blower number 1. It is powered by a single-phase induction motor with motor capacitor. It runs on a fixed speed, and in Miele dryers it is also used to turn the drum. And for that purpose there are two pulleys on the backside that are also used to reduce the rotational speed of the motor and also connected to the drum via a ribbed belt, and we have seen that earlier in the video. I'm removing the bigger pulley as we won't need it for our purpose here. One way to find out about the age of many machines like this, by the way, is to check for the date codes on the motor capacitors. This one has a date code from February 1996. I am taking off the guard because there's usually a fair amount of crud in there. Probably some amalgamation of washing powder, textile fiber and tissue paper that people forgot in their pockets in the winter of '98. But anyway, after cleaning that, I put the blower back together and it's as good as new. A 3D printed adapter can now simply be installed here. I later also used some super glue to hold it in place. In this case, it reduces the 124mm outer diameter of that ring to the 110mm inner diameter of this standard hose here that I had to buy for this purpose. But more about that in just a few minutes. As mentioned before, the second blower also comes in a much simpler, separate enclosure in older models and is here molded into one complex part. The actual blower can simply be removed by unscrewing a bunch of screws, and here you can see that this was made by EBM in Germany, just like the industrial blower we saw a few minutes ago. It even has almost the same size. If you really want to have it, the larger plastic part can be separated using an angle grinder. It's a bit of a mess, but you can do it. Another 3D printed adapter is just glued in place with MS polymer, and now you can just install the same style of hose here that we used with the bigger blower. But before we can actually use them, we have to add another upgrade to the CNC table, without which none of this would really make much sense. See, the brunt of the molten metal is sprayed downward into the swamp or water basin that I added to the CNC table a few months ago. And even though most of it is quenched right away, a certain percentage is sprayed outside the confines of the water table where it hits the ground and other random things around the shop. This does not only create a fire hazard, but it also creates lots of smoke as smoldering pieces of steel sit on various surfaces in the workshop. There is also a lot of fumes under the table, and that is why I have now bought a bunch of steel sheets that I will use to encase the frame of the CNC table. And I start by closing the left-hand side of the frame by tack welding the sheets in place. There is normally a lot more water in the swamp, by the way. I have drained it to reduce weight to make it easier to move the table around so that I can actually install a steel sheet on the backside as well. And that's what I'm doing now. For the right-hand side, the CNC table actually needs to be called to action as it's being worked on. What I'm doing here is to cut a circular hole into one of the sheets so that a hose can be installed here to suck out the fumes from under the workpiece. While I welded the sheets on the left hand and back side in place, the other two walls will have to be removable. This is necessary because the water basin is actually meant to be height adjustable. It also needs to be cleaned and drained now and then, and it's very hard to reach when all sides of the frame are welded shut. This meant pre-drilling a lot of holes and hand tapping each and every one of them, so the sheet can be bolted in place instead of welded. While this happens in seconds here in the video, it actually took several hours. Every part needs to be aligned properly, and you always have to think about the fact that you have to leave room for future add-ons and improvements with a project like this. It takes a lot of time to take that into consideration, rather than just slapping something in place. But be that as it may, the front is now also detachable, and I have inserted one of the hoses here for a few tests. At the moment, the hose simply leads outside through an open window. I will have to come up with a more permanent solution for that, of course. Next to the new blower, you can see an older attempt at the same thing that I built several years ago. It's basically the same idea, only that the hose is not connected with a 3D printed part, but with a piece of galvanized steel tube that I glued in place with MS polymer adhesive. The blower is from another Miele dryer, but it's actually again almost 10 years older. It still works fine though. But since the hose that I connected back then is too short for this application, I removed the galvanized tube and replaced it with another printed adapter and connected a new hose identical to the other one. The idea at the moment is to test a combination of one hose sucking out the fumes from underneath, while the second one is sitting up there over the torch. I'm currently still trying to find out which setup will work best, and I will present the results alongside other upgrades to this machine in future videos. So, most of what you see in my videos is the part of my life that I actually enjoy working on, despite all the effort and money that goes into it. Unfortunately, I also constantly have to take care of a million other things that keep coming up here all the time, and it often feels like an endless uphill battle to keep everything running. There is a reason why almost anyone who starts a business these days talks about business models that require a little more than a laptop and internet connection and a roof over your head. Having an actual physical place to take care of means a lot of rather unattractive daily chores that take up a lot of your time and that I really can't turn into interesting content. And at this point, I would like to mention that I require your help in continuing to make these videos. One of the best ways to help with the future production of videos is to support this channel on Patreon or to make a donation. You can find links for both directly under this video. But it's actually not even all the chores that make all this sometimes feel like this uphill battle. It's the recklessness and outright criminal behavior happening around me all the time that makes everything so hard. It starts with small things like people tossing their garbage on the streets right in front of my workshop. So many days start by me cleaning the streets in front of the gate to fend off the broken windows effect. And I'm not talking about some candy wrappers here and there, but rather something like this. And forget about the time that you're wasting doing this. Just imagine the kind of mood that your day starts with when this is the first thing you see when you go to work. And then when I park my trailers outside and leave them there for a little too long, sneaky construction workers have unloaded heavy bags of rubble and construction waste onto my trailers. Another time someone has punctured the tires with a knife. Then, last winter my camper was broken into and the windows had been smashed in needlessly. Other times we find stolen bicycles and motorcycles in the streets in front of the workshop. I have even called the cops on people who have stripped stolen motorcycles on the streets in broad daylight. Another thing that started 2 years ago is that people have started to just hang out on people's porches and private properties in the neighborhood, and now just recently a final line has been crossed. As I had mentioned in the beginning of the video, there also were recent problems with break-ins at the workshop. So let's get that out of the way. And there's something else to get out of the way, and that's this balloon here. It's carrying a little satellite. It's because it was my birthday a few days ago, and my girlfriend, together with a bunch of friends of mine, she had something special for me in mind, and that is a visit to the German Space Agency, or the local subsidiary of that, I guess. So I hope that that's going to happen in January or February. So yeah, while that was one source of positive emotions, my birthday, it's not been that great recently, and one reason for that is that, well, at the end of September I had left on a short vacation. I was in Greece, and only one day after leaving Germany I get this call from home from a buddy who happens to have keys to the property outside the workshop where he usually parks his mountain bikes. And he's calling me, letting me know that, well, his 2 mountain bikes that had been there the evening before were missing. Well, there was a little bit of back and forth because I wasn't sure if he was just confused about where he might have put them. But it was just one day, and he's not that old, so he should remember. Anyway, he was very quick to call it a burglary. He said, okay, this has been stolen, but I'm pretty sure they're not coming back. Must be some teenagers who were mostly in it for the thrills or anything. And he secured whatever else he had parked out there. But only half an hour later, and this is, as you can see in the footage, not even 8 p.m. in the evening, it had just turned dark outside, a guy is jumping the fence, and I get a notification on my phone because there's a CCTV camera there. And just in the outermost angle of that camera, you can actually see someone jumping the fence. Now in this case, you see him actually leaving the property. And well, when I got this notification, I called my buddy back home, told him to call the cops, which he did, and they arrived only about 5 minutes later, which is great. The problem is, since the camera didn't catch him as he was coming, well, onto the property, but only as he left, of course, they didn't get the guy. So what you're seeing here is insanity, man. This guy is stealing 2 crates of water. Now these are boxes with empty water bottles in them. There's a deposit on those. You can bring them to a grocery store and get like a few bucks. So the combined value of these 2 objects that he's like carrying away here is like 10 bucks. This is ridiculous, of course, and who knows what this person you know, what this person is all about. But one thing's for sure, it wasn't his only visit because he had stolen these mountain bikes. But be all that as it may, I should actually focus on something more positive because I've already wasted so much time in my life worrying about these little things that are going on here in this corner of the world and worrying without being able to change anything about it. So I should actually focus on the fact that this could be awesome. And by this I mean the fact that thousands of people from all over the world have been following me for a couple of years now, and this could actually be an incredible network, and there could be lots of opportunities here to also make better videos, frankly. So 2 years ago I was in the UK, and my grand idea was to meet all kinds of people, viewers of mine, go to workshops, have them show me around and show me different places in the UK. And well, I went to the UK and I attended this conference where there were lots of YouTubers also from the maker, you know, world of YouTube. And that was cool and everything. The only problem is that the trip was then cut short by me catching COVID, which was still a big deal back then. And I couldn't visit all those people, which I'm terribly sorry about. And I'm actually planning to return to the UK sooner or later. However, this time I have set my sights on a different place on the other side of the world, and that is Australia. I would like to do the same thing over there, basically. So this message goes out to all the viewers in Australia. If you would be interested in meeting me, please contact me, and there will be an email address for that in this video. I would give you other contact info, but I can't just put my phone number or something here in the video, as you might understand. So if you send me that one email, we can then find other ways to get connected. So this goes out to all the viewers who would be interested in meeting me. And this could take different shapes and forms. It could be just you working on a project that you want to show me, or working in a company and you want to show me that company, or maybe you have a business, or just something interesting in Australia you wanted to show me. Or maybe you just want to meet me. I would like to film this to make videos from it, but it's not necessary in every case. So don't shy away from saying hello just because you don't want to be on camera. That's not necessary. And as I might have said before, I've also been thinking about a format that works very differently from what I'm doing now. You know, my videos work in a way where I show things, I present them, and then people follow along and think, okay, this is how he solved it, this is how he thinks things should be done. But it doesn't have to be like that. You know, I could be, you know, like an intern in your company and just try to get along and learn like the ropes of it. I think that would be kind of cool. So I'm super open about this. I just would like to get to know the country, and if you have some interesting suggestion to make, just do it. This doesn't have to happen like tomorrow or next month or whatever, but sometime in the future would be nice. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting some messages from you guys. By the way, independent of my Australia plan, I just could need some help here in the workshop in Cologne in November and December. So if any one of you who happens to live closely by wants to come over for a day or two now and then and lend me a hand, that'd be great. You can use the same email address I showed before. And also, in case we have talked before and we have somehow lost contact, please don't take it personally and feel free to reach out again. I just have so much on my plate here all the time that these things happen sometimes. Also auch nochmal auf Deutsch, wenn ihr hier in der Nähe wohnt und mir hier in Köln in den nächsten Wochen mal für den Nachmittag helfen wollt, ein paar Sachen zu erledigen, dann schreibt mich ruhig an und vielleicht klappt es ja. See you soon, guys.